I won't repeat what I've just said. I'd like to begin with some, I want to thank some people for bringing me to Belo Horizonte. It's a great privilege and a pleasure for me to be here. I would like to begin by thanking your rector, Professor Campolina Diniz, who I have known for quite a long time, at least 10 years, and he initiated this invitation to the university, so thank you for bringing me here. I want to thank Professor Laureiro for bringing me here via the Institute of Interdisciplinary Studies. We've had some very good conversations so far, and I want to thank above all Professor Roberto Luis Montemor for being my host, but he has been more than a host. He is, again, we have had some extremely stimulating intellectual conversations, and he has looked after me in every sense, including introducing me to a wonderful group of people in architecture, directed by Professor Morado, who've been helping me with my study of the occupations and the favelas in Belo Horizonte. There are many young people I would like to name, but I won't because I know my time is short. You know who you are. Thank you very much for helping me during my stay. Initially, I was going to give a different talk as this IEAT public lecture. I was going to talk about, out of my last book, Land of Strangers, I was going to talk about the rise of intolerance and xenophobia in Europe. But Professor Montemor persuaded me to do otherwise, because mainly I think because of what happened here in June. And he felt that the events of June somehow resonated with the arguments that my co-author Nigel Thrift and I have been making in the book Arts of the Political. So the reason why I say that is because I'm afraid this is not going to be a paper on the highest levels of scholarship, but it's going to be a political talk. But it's going to be a political talk that, of course, I situate in social thought and social theory. But I think it's a talk, or the issues that I will raise, I think, do need public airing. They do need discussing, because somehow we are all, those of us who find ourselves loosely defined on the left, are wondering about how to position ourselves, or how to position more accurately the left in the future. In a future that appears to be extremely dark and extremely uncertain, and at the same time, a future in which we don't really know what it is anymore to be political, or what politics means. Which is why I agreed with his invitation to do this kind of talk. So this talk is as experimental for me as it is likely to be for you. Okay, let me begin then. So let me begin with an observation that the global protests that we have seen over the last 2 years against dictatorship, against market society, and against the erosion of democracy, however you define it. Here I'm thinking of the Arab Spring, the Occupy movement, the Indignados in Spain, the Occupy movement in North America, the protests across Europe against the financial crisis, a banking-led crisis which has become a crisis for humanity, the protests against austerity measures again in Europe, the various experiments that we see around the world, let's call them experiments of direct democracy, from street action to organizing life in a different kind of way. All of these developments over the last 2 years, in my view, have opened up the political in quite remarkable ways. These movements have introduced new tactics, new claims, and a desire for a future that looks very different from everything that we have today. Everything that we have today defined or understood by the movements of the street as a status quo that is authoritarian and unjust. So somewhere in the background here, or sometimes in the foreground, amongst these movements there is a critique of the present as unacceptable, as undemocratic, and one that doesn't actually work for the people. Now the paradox is that politics as we know it, top down, and by and large wedded to fixed procedures, either authoritarian rule, or elite rule, or representative democracy, has tended to respond to these last 2 years by rejecting direct democracy. Especially when these developments, when the protests are at home. So Britain and America were very happy with the Arab Spring because it was in Egypt and the rest of North Africa. But they didn't like the Occupy movement within North America. The British government was very happy with the Arab Spring, but detested the occupation of the streets by students who were protesting about increases in fees. And I could carry on until the end of this lecture with a whole series of examples to show that the world of official politics has faced up to the world of direct democracy by rejecting it, by closing down on it. And so, the observation I want to open with is that the more the theater of the political expands, and by political I simply mean the area of disputation and public presence, the more the theater of politics, which I would call, let's call them the modes of established conduct, political conduct, closes down. In the liberal democracies, which is the focus of my talk, formal politics, whether it is left-wing or right-wing, has been very reluctant to concede to direct democracy, or much more seriously, has been very reluctant to concede to the presumptions, the nostra, of market society, individualism, and rule by experts. Anything that challenges the givens of politics, of political tradition, has been judged at best to be a distraction, and at worst, dangerous. So there's a kind of sense that what's happening on the street, at home, not abroad, is dangerous. And I think one of the consequences of this is that history in the making, and I mean that phrase, history in the making, is being forced, like sand in the egg timer. I don't know if this metaphor works in Portuguese. It's the thing that you use to measure how long it takes to boil an egg. Like sand in an egg timer, has been forced through the structures, the strictures of tried and tested political forms to be framed, in public culture as anomalous and counter-historical. Framed in public culture as counter-historical, actually by a very powerful coalition of vested interests that include big parties, corporations, the media, sometimes universities. And so I think as a result what's happening is that the terrain of struggle, the political, is that as the terrain of the political becomes more and more plural, more and more autonomous, and more counter-hegemonic, this is not how it appears in public culture. This is not how it is registered in the world of politics. It is almost as though politics is now against the political. That's my thesis. That's what I'm trying to argue. And just as the tools of the political become more and more hybrid, glamorous, occupationalist, autonomist, protest-based, this is not how the political establishment wants it. So we are beginning to see, in my view, a gigantic divorce between politics and the political. Now, those outside of the political, the young people on the streets, the people who are occupying Tahrir Square, the people who took over Taksim Square, the people who are demanding a different form of democracy, are aware of this contradiction, I think. But here is my first paradox. They are often not worried about the divorce of the political from politics. In this sense, because they believe, or at least some of the intellectuals of direct democracy, I'm thinking here of Jacques Rancière, Alain Badiou, Slavoj Žižek, David Harvey himself, because they believe that further agitation, more glamorous activity, will help to weaken an old order that already stands on its last legs. That capitalism is finished. That more direct democracy will help to strengthen, let's call it horizontal and not vertical politics. That direct democracy, in the end, will help to make visible a future in the making. That direct democracy is on the side of history, or history is on the side of direct democracy. History in the making, which is run by and out of communities, social movements, informal organizations, and so on. So, sometimes when I read the pamphlets and the works that come out of people who are involved in direct democracy, you get a sense that they feel that they are riding the tide of history, or at least the tide of history is moving. Even if slowly, even if with many, many setbacks, that there is no turning back, there is no turning point either. Some of these instincts and sentiments I am broadly sympathetic with, but at the same time, I am not entirely convinced that history is on the side of direct democracy. Because many of the victories of the developments that we've seen in the last 2 years remain extremely fragile. They are very, very fragmented because the causes are very different and fragmented and they're not connected up. There is reversal. Look what has happened in Egypt. And above all, I think there is a problem there with direct democracy because whatever gains have been made often come as small concessions which don't stack up, that don't add up. So there's a huge problem at the moment with the, if we look at the outcomes of direct democracy, how much of this actually has led to a tangible improvement in the lives in whose name direct democracy functions. Secondly, I think it is absolutely the case that the politics of the old order, however you define the old order, is anything but on its last legs, ready to concede. My reading of the response to direct democracy over the last 2 years has been that the more authority has been questioned, the more it fights back. The more capitalism has been exposed, the more we see of the market. The more people choose to come out on the street, the more the state responds with extreme forms of violence. And that the old order is still absolutely, because of its control over the legislature, over policy, over bureaucracies and over institutions, is still very much in control of the distribution of well-being. Is still very much in control of the formation of public opinion, or let's call it public culture, and is still very much in control of framing the future as calamitous, as risky, unless it is returned to the status quo. Of course, there are small concessions on the margins when it is deemed politically necessary to give small concessions to what the protesters require. But by and large, my reading, and it's a pessimistic reading of the last 2 years, is that the response to direct democracy has been closure, and a closure that actually has been very effective. So the strictures of the egg timer are very narrow and very real indeed. So let me move. I'm still in my introduction, okay? Let me move to the next stage. In all of this, another extraordinary paradox. The organized left, the official left, the political parties, the unions, and all those institutions that have historically associated themselves with socialism or social democracy have been nowhere to be seen. The official left has been surprisingly invisible over the last 2 years, except when it is in government and then it has just come back with a vengeance. Okay? But I'm thinking here of the official or the organized left out of government. Too timid, too weak, too arrogant. The established social democratic and socialist forces have kept well away from the grassroots developments, seeing them as marginal or misplaced. They have neither allied with the insurrectionary forces, the activists, especially at home, nor have they tried to learn from them. Instead, the organized left, locked in tradition or inertia, and absolutely blinded by the power of corporations, the media, a public culture which is dominated by elites. This organized left has assumed that the only way forward is reform within the context of the status quo. That the rules of the status quo, the rules of politics, must not be changed. But the rules of politics must be used, maybe, to win small concessionary reforms. Agitation, the politics of social transformation, an explicit commitment to the equal and just society, and the critique of power are nowhere to be seen in the repertory of the existing left. All we have is a weak defense of some kind of redistributive capitalism in Europe, okay? In Latin America, things might be different. You will tell me at the end. But certainly in Europe, this is the space occupied by the left. So, a question. Does this invisibility of the left, of the organized left, matter? Why should we be bothered about the relationship between the official left and direct democracy? Well, what's interesting is that for the protagonists of direct democracy, the absence of the official left doesn't really matter that much, in general terms. Why? Because, rightly I think, to a degree they remain suspicious of top-down politics, that the official left will be opportunistic about direct democracy. Or, because as I said earlier, the protagonists of direct democracy feel that agitation in its own right will lead to change. The more we push, the more the barricades will come down. So, I want to argue exactly the opposite. I want to propose that without the involvement of the organized left, the chances of a politics of social transformation that's able to deliver long-term tangible outcomes remain very precarious, because the many fragmented and transient beauties of the counterculture in the end, in my view, do require institutionalization and institutional amplification, so that these demands can lead to reforms that then produce tangible reforms. And also, I think the organized left is required because the forces of the status quo are so extraordinarily powerful and require some kind of similar organizational counterforce. One which the historic left, if it decided to play a role, could play a very significant part in mobilizing. I should say, by way of parenthesis, I am very conscious of how unpopular my argument will be amongst those of you who are committed to a politics of direct democracy. But if it helps, I'm about to make myself unpopular with the organized left as well, if there are those of you within the audience who belong to the organized left. Because what I want to argue is that I do not see the way forward as that of an organized left, the major parties, the labor union, and whoever else simply throwing their weight in behind the grassroots struggles. In fact, quite the opposite. As Nigel Thrift and I proposed in our new book, Arts of the Political, which was kindly introduced at the beginning, at a time of near extinction in the liberal democracies of the left, if this left has any future, we would argue, it must reinvent itself by becoming a protagonist, the protagonist, in refashioning the goals, the modalities, and the instruments of politics. And ironically, it should do this in the way, exactly in the way that the experiments of direct democracy are trying to do in opening up the political, by displacing politics. And exactly in the way that I think the left, the Latin American left, initiated 10 years ago in your country, but also in places like Venezuela. So my argument, or my claim, my thesis is that if the left is to find itself on the side of a future that is not part of the status quo, then it has to break with politics itself. It must involve itself in the expansion and the redefinition of the political. And in such a way that the status quo and status quo politics and the protagonists of status quo politics begin to appear themselves as inadequate and anomalous within public culture. So what I want to try and argue is that the official left needs to become much more ambitious. It needs to become what we call in the book a force with world-making capacity, with world-making intention. A world-making intentionality that is carried forward through new political arts that are capable of moving beyond the status quo. Now, this is of course asking for the nearly impossible, particularly from a left that's forgotten exactly why it is left, why it exists in the political arena. But let's consider the possibility that without such a renewal of this kind of very ambitious, heroic nature, the left will die in any case. The left will simply disappear. Precisely because of the colonization of the social that we see across the world by corporatist neoliberalism. This is the combination of corporations and markets. And because of the extraordinary influence held by the media, which is also part of the corporatist neoliberal project, which in turn, the third leg of the stool, is elites, corporations, the media, and other kind of big institutions that do politics through popular appeasement, that do politics precisely on the basis of that which is likely to appeal to the people or not appeal to the people. You know, so our future is a corporatist, populist blancmange, which promises very little to the left, in any case. Consider also that in its formative years, late 19th century Europe, the anti-colonial 20th century, the 1960s and the 1970s, and different struggles against dictatorship right through the course of the 20th century, if we ask ourselves, how did the left gain traction at that time? I think the answer is, and that's what I want to try and show now, is that the answer is that the left, in its formative years, managed to achieve a lot and became attractive because it radically altered the nature of the political. It radically altered the political prospectus and the means of politics. Sometimes in hopelessly utopian ways that became dystopias, sometimes in innovatively pragmatic ways that gave us many, many of the means by which we lead our lives comfortably today. So, I want to move now to the second part of my talk. Let me dwell very briefly on the late European 19th century, when the left first began to emerge, to illustrate my point. The years between 1880 and 1914 in Europe tell us something very significant about the passage from agitation to radical reform through an overhaul of the ground of politics. Let's just recall, the late 19th century in Europe was a period when, against the grain of general misery, oppression and political closure, the reformist and the revolutionary left came into being. Not only came into being, but it managed to change hearts and minds, as well as to secure some very lasting material and institutional gains. Many are the transformational struggles and achievements from that period. It really was an extraordinary period in history. The rise of the labor movement, excuse me, the formation of the socialist, social democratic and pragmatic diagrams of future well-being and community. This was the period during which campaigns for alternative lifestyles, such as vegetarianism, grew. Did you know that? The campaign for the great outdoors and sexual liberation occurred in the late 19th century, along with the first stirring, the first movements against imperial colonization. So what I'm trying to say is that against the historical grain, life today, that period became a period of extraordinary mass mobilization and political inventiveness. And I want to just very briefly settle on two examples that I think illustrate my point quite well. That illustrate the point between making for change by expanding the political in order to make politics look small. The first example, and finally we come to the first PowerPoint slide. The first example we might describe as a politics of new utopia, which is made tangible through the efforts of an emerging left. And we might describe it as the in inverted commas, the pragmatic Marxism of the German Socialist Party, the SPD. So the SPD is formed in 1875 amidst a huge amount of uncertainty about its direction and its reach. It was a very weak party. There were other competing reformist movements that nobody even remotely thought the SPD would survive. The movement was led by two very towering figures, August Bebel and Karl Kautsky. The party quickly rose to dominate the European socialist movement. And most significantly, it developed a very significant presence in Germany. So it's formed in 1875, and by 1912 it has 1 million members and 35% of the vote in the Reichstag, which is quite a significant achievement. And the well-known factors behind the SPD's success at a time of open struggle between emerging industrial interests, declining aristocratic power, the continuation of Bismarckian autocracy, an extremely differentiated and divided population. We know that, or history tells us that the success of the SPD was because of the power of ideology, the power of strong leadership, the power of organized discipline. But actually there was a lot more, and I think there was a lot more which speaks to the kind of argument that I'm trying to make. The success of the SPD, how can I put it, involved altering the subjectivity of the future and radically altering the rules of the game, the rules of engagement. There were three things that are really quite distinctive that speak to this notion of the developing and expanded political. Firstly, managed to project a future around a very small and emerging industrial proletariat. It created a new political subject and said that what could be fought for that particular subject was a future for everybody. These first socialists invented, as Donald Sassoon has argued, a new political subject and a new vanguard actor, the working class, and the new model worker. Out of what was in reality a poor, desperate, fragmented, and downtrodden working class. A working mass, in fact, not even a working class. So, this was an extraordinary political invention for the time, which was then made tangible, secondly, by the ability of the SPD to win significant practical reforms at the time, exactly at that time. So already in the 1875 to 1912 period, the SPD is beginning to get better wages, is beginning to improve working conditions, it's beginning to get welfare protections for its members. Thirdly, the SPD was able to close the movement, to envelop the movement, in the words of the then Austrian leader of the Social Democrats, Julius Brantal, with, I quote, the beauty of 1,000 stars. And the way the SPD did this was by, it did so by inventing new political technologies. Popular books like Babel's Women and Socialism, pamphlets, newspapers, social gatherings, and a whole host of new political technologies which would project the future as something very different from the present. So while this, how much more time do I have? Okay. While this, the German example illustrates the power, can I have the next one? Great. The power of the politics of pragmatic, no, the one before. Politics of pragmatic utopianism. This, my second example, the example of the British women's movement in the 1910s, the women's movement. Were they the other way around? Ah, okay. All right, never mind. My apologies. What these women's movements did is interesting because of the overhaul of politics itself as a landscape, as a technology, and as a field of actors. We know the British women's movement for the suffrage movement, which was the movement was involved in winning the vote for women. But again, in reality, what the suffrage movement did at that time was it completely redefined the actors and the beneficiaries of public life. And it did this by questioning, I think for the very first time, the distinction between public culture as a masculine arena and the private sphere as one in which women could play a restricted role. I think the real significance of the early years of the feminist movement lay once again in altering the meaning and the intersections of the private and the public. And by altering this nature, our understanding of the nature of the private and the public, they brought into the political domain a whole series of injuries and injustices that women suffered at the time. And here too there are three inventions of the political that are really quite significant. One is the projection of the figure of the new woman after 1890, which helped to expand, which until then had been a force just fighting for the vote, into one that started campaigning for what it meant to be a woman. This was a period in which you had an enormous amount of discussion in pamphlets and in books and in popular magazines. What does it mean to be a woman? What does it mean to be a liberated woman? What does it mean to be a modern woman? And it's in this period, while the stuff was going on about winning the vote, you had this very fertile set of discussions amongst women about equality within the family, the right to divorce, the right to practice sexual freedom, the presence of women in the economy, the presence of women in public and political life. And what was going on here was that a new sense of gender and gender politics, or the gender nature of politics, was beginning to emerge for the first time ever in that part of the world. So they managed to do what they did by altering our understanding of what it means to be a woman, what it means to be a woman in public life, and can the political exist without the involvement of women? That's the point I'm trying to make. A second invention, and I'm running short of time, so I'll just move on quite quickly, but again it illustrates my point, is the projection of the woman as a collective subject. Remember, at that time, women were seen only as, if you like, private individuals, not as collective subjects. And this happened through the campaign for women's rights, particularly in the workplace, which linked feminism with an emerging labor movement and a socialist movement. And it also began to create a link of subjectivity between the working woman, okay, and the bourgeois woman at home. Third, and I think most interestingly for me, was this was a time of extreme political closure. Women didn't have the vote, but there were also certain ways in which you did politics through parliament, if you managed to get into parliament. And Emily Pankhurst's movement, the Women's Social and Political Union, the WSPU, broke into all of this by occupying the political in very new ways. The tactics of the WSPU involved military organization, glamorous journalism, the cultivation of the car as a symbol of modernity, lots and lots of banners, chaining yourself to the Houses of Parliament. Many songs were produced, many plays were written, there were many public confrontations, there were many prison cells, and protests were extraordinarily visible. what the women's movement did, it began to occupy the political by inventing new political technologies. And by making these new political technologies legitimate ways of making protest and representation, they couldn't have achieved what they achieved, and as a mass force, without forcing open the political. That's the point I'm trying to make. Now, clearly, I now move to the final part of my talk. Clearly, my account of that rich and diverse period of European history is selective, decontextualized, and full of all the pitfalls of post hoc research. But I do think a general point can be made, which is this. The left at its origins proved to be influential and meaningful because of its world-making qualities. It thoroughly changed the meaning of the political and of political subjectivity by doing three things. Firstly, by designing utopias and imaginations of emancipation out of existing hidden injuries. It made visible that which was invisible. And by making the invisible visible, it showed that another future was possible. Secondly, that this emerging left managed to build desire and affective sentiments through new technologies of representation, combat, and identification. New structures of feeling were created by this emerging left. Thirdly, and uniquely, in complete contrast to today, it converted claims into practical gains, into practical reforms, through very effective organization and subsequent institutionalization, either by getting into parliament, or into power, or by forcing legislative change, or by bureaucratizing the concessions which were made by the state. So my thesis is that the organized left today needs to recover this world-making capacity by making something out of the very many injustices and countercurrents that our societies confront today. Although the organized left does not see this, isn't it strange that there is no shortage of injury that requires attention in our world today? And much more importantly, there is no shortage of counter-organization. Can you have the next one, please? Of counter-organization in the face today of capitalist entrenchment, inequality, environmental destruction, and so on and so forth. As this slide that I've just put on shows, it's not as though there isn't enough already available for the left, the organized left, if it chose to do so, to build up. The organized left could make the 1,001 experiments of direct and indirect democracy that we see around the world today into its own cause. It could incorporate these things as part of a new left project. By explicitly committing to a politics of transformation rather than a politics of the status quo. This table simply summarizes, in the area in which my co-author and I think the world faces 5 biggest challenges, the kinds of countercurrents that are already available now, but actually this was 2 years ago, so this table could be changed already. Okay. The 5 huge challenges of market fundamentalism, the financialization of the economy, global inequality, climate change, and the reconstitution of human being by technologies. Okay, the rise of the, let's call it the biopolitical. In all these areas where the hegemony of closure around markets, around fictive money, fictional money, around excessive global inequality, about insane treatment of nature, and around, the substitution of the human through the most brutal forms of technological interventionism, genetic, through to something else. In all these 5 areas, there is an enormous amount of counter-organization going on. In the area of market fundamentalism, the campaign for, and in some places, success in achieving the basic wage, employee ownership, supporting cooperatives, social enterprise, experiments in fair trade and trade, ethical consumption, the formalization of non-monetary exchange, the world of microfinance, many experiments of low-cost housing, workplace democracy, gifting, land borrowing, land reclamation, occupation, or in the area of global inequality, the Tobin tax, which is a tax through which automatically the rich countries are taxed to pass on a small amount of money to the poorer economies, the building up of alternative trading blocks, making patenting a public good, no private patenting of, let us say, pharmaceutical products, providing underage workers in developing countries, India in particular, paid schooling, rather than just taking them out of work. All kinds of things which are listed on that table. So the first point I want to make about the contemporary left, about contemporary left renewal, is that there is no shortage, of course, there is no shortage of example of what the equal and fair society could look like. And I say that simply because the left says, what should we do? What should the staples of the left look like? And you only need to look beyond the end of your nose to know what to align yourself with. There is ample material here for a manifesto if this is what the left really wants. And no real reason either to pick some of these things on the table and not others, because the left is extremely good at constructing hierarchies of worth, okay? Whether it is more important to support social enterprise or income redistribution, whether it is more important to provide universal health care or control technologies for human well-being. Of course, there are always fiscal and financial constraints, but why is it not possible, at least in constructing a manifesto, to embrace all of this? I don't really understand why a left that seeks to reinvent itself cannot be a pluralist force that stands for all kinds of experiments in democracy, rather than one particular form of what we would choose to call the high points of the fair and equal society. But from what I've said earlier, embracing the counter-hegemonic, all the things on that table, alone will not suffice, because it adds no traction. For this, like its forebears, like its antecedents in the past, I strongly believe that the left needs to become much more involved as I've said already, in transforming the political itself. And in such a way that routine expectations and routine practices are completely disarmed, are shifted to one corner. So how does the left do this? How does a left that aspires, that wants to be world-making, do this? I think it does this by attending to the arts of traction, the arts of amplification. So I don't see this as a question of visualizing the house on the hill that the left must build. Nor do I think this is a question of visualizing the journey or defining clearly the journey to be taken to achieve, to get to the house on the hill. Nor do I think it's a challenge of predetermining the quantities and the qualities of the equal and just society. Yeah? More rights for women, less rights for indigenous people. It's not a question of the quantities and the qualities of the equal and just society. But instead, I think the real challenge that the left faces here is one of building imaginaries, sentiments, and political tools around plural causes, so that in the end, the rightness of these causes are visualized, and I literally mean this, are visualized as the foothills of a hitherto unimagined new world. That's the kind of project I think the left could creatively become involved in. To make out of what there is already in terms of existing injuries and existing experiments in direct and indirect democracy, to show that these are the foothills of a hill or a mountain that still has to be climbed, that we don't even know the real shape of. But to make that a desire, a very strong public desire. Or to put it more pragmatically, to put it more prosaically, do we have the last two? I see the challenge as one of amplifying and connecting cause around a multiplicity of progressive quests. So that a certain kind of natural resonance begins to build around the repertory of experiments, kind of experiments that you saw in Figure 1. Some of the detail of what can manage out of the politics of amplification, where you focus specifically not so much on the content of politics, but on the arts of the political, we can see in the slide that I've just put up now. Again, in the context of the 5 global challenges that I mentioned earlier. And let me just quickly pick up on 2 examples. I've got 5 minutes. Just in the area of market fundamentalism, why is it not possible for the left to become involved in the game of disclosure? To say that markets are not actually invisible, but they're very visible actors that create all kinds of good and bad things. To make visible a politics of regulation of markets, to say this is absolutely necessary for the construction of a fair society. To build all kinds of anxieties and hopes around a particular kind of a market economy or a non-market economy. To make positive uses of anxiety, to say, look, if we have more and more neoliberalism, these are the kinds of fears, these are the kinds of consequences that will come around. To build on the successes of things like ethical consumerism, to make some campaigns of success, to go viral, that's what the internet is there for. To engage into a whole kind of new politics of rethinking markets, creating new sentiments around forms of exchange that are much more reciprocal and trust-based, to make to make an enormous amount of headway in and out of government, to legislate for the social economy, to legislate for non-monetary exchange, to give a social tag to market relations, to make absolutely clear this product comes from this factory, this product comes from this kind of sphere of exploitation, this product comes from this kind of ethical practice. There's just so much that could be done by the left to completely dislocate market from corporatism, to make markets appear as the arena of ethical engagement. And exactly the same sort of thing could be done in the four other areas in which the world faces such a tough future at the moment. It's a kind of a politics of amplification that requires attending to the arts of invention, organization, and affective mobilization. And I think the sum of this kind of amplification, politics of amplification, would be the slow but gradual alteration of the landscape of political and popular opinion and expectation, with so much more slowly added in terms of possibilities, rights, responsibilities, deliberative audit, so that in the end, a politics of amplification in which the politics of action for the few begins to look distinctly unacceptable, even within the media and corporate culture and public culture in general. Because here the left will have involved itself as much in the issue itself, what do we fight for, as in the terrain in which the issue lands. In other words, what I'm saying is that the left, if it's serious about becoming a world-making project, needs to work on new technologies of political expression and representation. It needs to work on new structures of feeling for the just and equal society, looking for ways in which in schools, in universities, in workplaces and so on, it makes things like fairness and autonomy and labor and solidarity as natural human instincts, rather than as denatured human instincts. Where it systematically works on campaigns to reduce corporate power, state brutality, and media manipulation. Where it systematically tries to break down the bureaucratic capture of the unequal society. So let me conclude now. First, I think the left today is a long way away from a politics of this kind of renewal. When the existing left is not appeasing global elites or markets or the citizen treated as consumer, then what does it do? It tends to engage in the purity of manifestos, endlessly debating whether to include in tomorrow's manifesto more or less income redistribution, more or less collective ownership, more or less public goods, more or less markets, more or less controls, more or less social enterprise, job sharing, sustainable consumption, environmental stewardship. It's a kind of politics of list making. What's interesting is that the politics of list making, the politics of manifesto within the left, has had no support whatsoever. the strength of support for this kind of exercise, at least in the liberal democracies, has been very, very weak. Nobody's interested when the left says we're interested in social enterprise, in public goods, in public housing, in all these things that to most of us appear to be very good things. And I don't think the problem is because the need for such reforms does not exist. By God, does the need exist? And it's not because the public is stupid, that the public has been fetishized by, the classical Marxist statement that commodity fetishism has destroyed the public and has made the public unthinking. Nor do I think it's because the guardians of the status quo are invincible. Corporate power is not as strong as we think it is. If the politics of manifesto is weak today, I think it is because the theater of political possibility has closed down. The tangibility and the palpability for another world that's very different from our own has become unthinkable beyond the corridors of autonomous communities and direct democrats. I think that a return of the left to a politics of world-making, where its labor focuses on the ground on which manifestos might land. Okay, let me repeat that. Where it concentrates on the ground on which manifestos might land, would be a step in the right direction. In our times, I think this is what the official struggle against apartheid tried to do in South Africa. I think this is what the British Labour Party tried to achieve when it came out of the war, when it constructed the beauty of the welfare state. I think this is what the Latin American dawn against dictatorship and neoliberalism did a few years ago. None of these things remain. I will stop there.